Hello, everyone. I'm Gary Summers, and welcome to the audio edition of Mind, Body, Soul, a show about your mental, physical, and spiritual wellness. Well, I have with me today a conflict management coach and a consultant, Tammy Sheppard, who is going to talk about conflict resolution and how do we somehow manage to get past our own need to be right and to figure out with some type of a resolution so that both people can win. Welcome, Tammy Sheppard.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk to us. So, Tammy, conflict resolution. I know we've talked about this, and you know we could take 2 or 3 days to talk about all the different areas, but just give our for a 30-minute interview, just give our listeners an overview of what they can expect to hear from you over the next 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, so what I'm going to be talking about mostly is just to give people a little bit of an idea of what causes conflict, what typically gets in the way of resolving it, some approaches that we use when we're trying to resolve our conflicts, and then because some are more effective than others, and then some strategies that hopefully people can take away, just some tools in their toolbox.
Okay, perfect. Sounds great. So, and I'm sure you've seen enough being a consultant, and you've seen enough conflict in the workplace, and I'm sure you've come across enough immature people to write a book about. So, what often causes conflict? What are the major things that cause conflict in the workplace?
Yeah, so I think a good place to kind of start with that is just so that, people understand that not all conflict is bad. Conflict, it's very common. It's inevitable. You can't avoid it. Everyone has differences. So I find the problem occurs when we react inappropriately, when we have differences with people. That's the issue. It's not the conflict itself. And even the word conflict, it just drums up these negative images. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of us were taught from an early age, try and get along in the sandbox. Keep the peace, be nice. Don't rock the boat. And even being taught, don't speak unless spoken to. Right. So if you voiced a different opinion or perspective, you were often viewed as being difficult. So I don't think there's any wonder why, many adults today are conflict avoidant, and they just don't know how to have difficult conversations.
Yeah, and I guess part of the issue too is, many of us probably have been raised, as you said, is to try and avoid it as much as you possibly can. But, I think people need to realize that just because someone has a different opinion than you do doesn't mean that they're right and you're wrong.
Exactly.
It just means that we just have different opinions, and to expect a difference of opinion is normal, isn't it?
Exactly.
Right?
That's right. And that's what we want, because can you picture an organization where everyone always agreed that the things should never change? Mm-hmm. Everyone agreed with everything. I mean, you would have zero creativity and innovation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I mean, that's the healthy conflict. That's what we want in organizations.
Well, you want people to be able to be comfortable enough to bring up a situation where their viewpoint might help the organization.
Right. Exactly. It's the destructive conflict. That's the problematic one.
Right.
People don't communicate effectively, and obviously they have lots of unfounded assumptions and judgments and some of that stuff as well.
Yeah.
But, understanding the cause of conflict, of where it's coming from, because there's a lot of different sources for it. Some of it is about, structure of the systems that we work in. And I don't know about you, but I don't know of any workplace that has unlimited resources, like
absolutely
unlimited time, money, office space.
Yeah.
I don't know of any place like that. So when people have to compete over resources, I mean, you're going to get conflict just from that. If people,
sorry, no, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say if people even don't understand what their role is in the workplace.
Well,
you're not clear on the role.
Right. Well, that's management's job, I guess, to kind of tell them what their role is, and when there's a conflict there. But I mean, I've talked to organizations I've been in, and have had coworkers who sit across from each other and they haven't spoken to each other in a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do you work in an environment like that? So, and what other causes have you seen in with your experience?
Yeah. So, like I said, when people don't know their roles, you get conflict between colleagues about who's supposed to do what, so you get about that.
Yeah.
You get conflict about just information. People either have too much of it, not enough of it, they different interpretations of it. So you get into conflict about that. The relationships is the big one, the interpersonal conflict, which I deal a lot with. So
Well,
when you have
especially people with different personalities, right?
exactly right,
you get someone who's laid back, you get someone who's more aggressive, then right away now
right,
you've got an issue there. Yeah, okay, sorry, go ahead.
exactly, different personalities, a person's behavior, poor communication, jealousy. There's so many different things that are going on there, and that can often lead to a tit for tat type of behavior. If you feel you're treated unfairly, you retaliate, and then that just perpetuates. You get into a cycle.
I think sometimes people would prefer to be right rather than to do what works. Would you say
Yeah,
that?
exactly.
Would you say that ego has a lot to do with that?
Yeah, I mean, ego does definitely play a part in that. And, that's kind of part of the thing of what is one of the barriers of resolving conflict that gets in the way.
Okay.
Right. So and it prevents people from giving apologies.
Yeah,
right. Because
that's another big one, isn't it?
it's huge. It's huge.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that, even when I have clients who are considering mediation, and they will say to me sometimes that I am not starting any communication with that person unless I get an apology first.
So
and it's very interesting because, in order to get that apology, the communication and understanding where the other person is coming from is really helpful. But some people expect the apology first before the conversation even starts, and it actually blocks them from going forward.
Why do you think?
Which is crazy when you think about it.
Yeah. Why do you think? Has anybody talked to you about why they feel they need an apology?
Well, because a lot of it comes back to they've been wronged and they're right, and there is absolutely no other perspective or any other explanation for it. So they get stuck in that tunnel vision and really can't see their way out. And if you feel that you've been wronged, then you want an apology for it.
Okay.
You want validation.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, because we all I guess the greatest human need is acceptance. Right? You want to be accepted, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So Tammy, what often gets in the way? You talked a little bit about of resolving a conflict. We talked a little bit about ego and wanting to get that apology. What's is that the biggest obstacle?
So there's two things that I find comes up over and over again when I deal with people who have interpersonal conflict. And one of the biggest ones is intention versus impact. And the second one would be, as you were saying, need to be right.
Okay.
So, and what I mean by intention versus impact, and I find this so interesting, that we judge our behavior by our intentions, which are positive,
right?
Our positive intentions, but we judge other people's behavior by the impact that it has on us, and that's a negative impact.
I heard someone had a quote. I was doing a cognitive behavioral therapy course a long time ago, and the guy said, "I have no idea what I said until I get a response," because your intention could be pure, but the other person hears something totally different.
Right. Yeah.
So when I and I heard another person say, when there's a disagreement with what's being said and what's being heard, I thought a great way to kind of clarify that would be is, can you put that another way?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than be, like you said, rather than being reactive and making an assumption about what the person said, it's just say, can you put that another way? Anyway, go ahead. I'm fascinated by particularly that intention versus impact, because I think most people who we work with, I'm sure they have a positive intention. I don't think anybody gets up in the morning and says, I think I'm going to upset some of my coworkers today. I'm sure there are a few
Yeah,
people.
like
I'm sure there are some people who do that, but most people are well-intentioned people.
Right. They're not getting up in the morning and saying, my sole intention today is to go in and just make everybody feel horrible. And that's not what happens.
No, right.
So, but that's what I find so interesting about it is that, if we say or do something that ends up hurting someone, we're very quick to say, oh, our intentions were good. I didn't mean that.
Right.
That wasn't my intention.
Right.
But what do you think we often assume about someone else's intention if they said or did something to hurt us?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You intentionally said something to hurt me.
Right.
Yeah.
We think they meant to hurt us.
Right.
And the more that we're personally offended or hurt, the more we think the other person meant it.
Yeah. But yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So that is one I find of the biggest things. And then, I mean, there's lots of different things. I'm picking just a couple.
Sure. Absolutely.
The second one, of course, is that need to be right.
Yeah.
So we all have different perceptions, interpretations of what's going on. And we know our beliefs determine our perspective, the point of view that we have. And people are often really entrenched in their positions, what they want, or they have a very strong opinion on something that forms their position.
Yeah.
And they often can't see the other person's perspective.
Yeah.
Because in their mind, there's no other possible because they're right.
Yeah.
So what's the point of even communicating? Right.
Yeah.
There's nothing for me to learn here. I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah.
And, you can have two people looking at the same thing and both can be correct from when they're standing. One of the pictures that when I do training, I bring up is there's a popular picture. You've probably seen it. It's two people, they're standing and facing each other and they have a number between them.
Mm-hmm.
And one person sees the number 6 and the other person sees the number 9.
Yeah. Yeah.
But from where they're standing, they're both right.
Yeah.
But neither of them sees what the other person is seeing, and they don't understand where it's coming from.
The same,
right? Nor do they care.
Yeah, the same picture is of you look at it, and some people see an old woman, an old lady, and some people see a young lady.
Exactly.
And so it's hard, it's hard to convince the person. Yeah, go ahead.
I find it unfortunate, really, that we often see what we want to see and we hear what we want to hear, but that's how we're wired. And really, we bring attention to whatever we choose to focus on. So, and I think before in some of the training you've done, you've used an example of if you're thinking about buying a car and saying, so if it's I can't remember now what car you used in your example, but if it's and you're thinking about buying it, you'll start to see more of them on the road.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's not because there's suddenly more white Honda Civics going around the city, but
right, because that's what you're looking for. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just noticing because that's our focus, right?
Yeah.
And it's so crazy that like in the workplace, we actually go around looking for evidence to support our incorrect perspectives and our faulty assumptions. Like we go around and we try and find other people who have the same opinion as us, because that makes us feel more comfortable and more right.
The psychological term for that is called confirmation bias.
Exactly.
And what it is you get so entrenched in a belief that you have that you ignore the facts and the evidence. And the more the person tries to convince you of your opposite viewpoint, the more entrenched you become in the belief that you have that you are right and everybody else is wrong. So I think it's important for people to understand that that's a common psychological thing that people have, but and so your job is to try and get them past that, right?
Right. Yes. And our brains don't like cognitive dissonance, right?
Exactly.
Right. We can't hold two conflicting beliefs or attitudes. Our brain is looking for that logic to explain what's going on in the world around us. And
our brain can only focus on one thing at a time. So when you're focusing on something negative, it's impossible for you to focus on something positive. It can't happen.
Yeah, it's all skewed. It's through what we call a conflict lens.
Right.
That's your view of the world.
Right.
So, and it doesn't matter what's going on in the environment because we filter it.
Yeah.
It's our own skewed lens. It's our narrow perspective. So, and our beliefs obviously alter our perceptions. So, Our brain loves, if we've got someone to blame for something, or our brains don't care if it's a correct assumption or not. It's an explanation. So it makes us feel better.
Yeah,
right?
and I think part of the issue is, and we can get into, once you let emotion come in to the conflict, now you've gone in a totally different area again. So why do people get so emotional and abrasive? Because that's when you've really taken a turn for the worst, right?
Yeah, and it's really biology. I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Goleman's work.
Oh yes, yeah.
Oftentimes, unfortunately, people look at emotions as being bad, but they're not bad. It's just a source of information. That's all it is. So they're not there for you to suppress or ignore. It's just your reaction.
I mean, anger, so, there's nothing wrong with anger. It's how you deal with anger is the problem.
Exactly.
It's called, I think Daniel Goleman talked about emotional intelligence.
Right.
And that's where you have to decide and who has emotional intelligence and who doesn't have emotional intelligence. I think the best description I had was Stephen Covey said, emotional intelligence is balancing your feelings with the feelings of others.
Yeah, it's a lot of us, it's interesting. We don't have the ability, even insight into our own emotions. If we feel anger, that's the surface, but that's not necessarily what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It could be shame underneath that,
sure.
or guilt or something like that. Right. So we don't even know how to interpret oftentimes our own emotions. So what Daniel Goleman talked about was an amygdala hijack. And I think it's important for people to understand what that is and when that's happening. So just to back it up a little bit, I guess. So, the two large areas of the brain, we have the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system.
Right.
Right. As you're quite aware.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and the limbic system is that primitive part. That's where, our automatic reactions.
Yeah. Fight or flight. Yeah.
Right. So if we even laugh out loud to a movie, without thinking about it, that's the limbic system.
Right.
It has positive things too.
Sure. Oh, sure.
But
Yeah.
it has the negative, right?
Yeah.
And the prefrontal cortex, of course, is our thinking brain.
Yeah.
That's where our reasoning and decision making and all that comes to. So when people are really emotionally escalated because someone said or did something that really offended them or hurt them, sometimes we get into what Daniel calls this amygdala hijack. So these, our amygdalas are located in the limbic system.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get into that zone, we can stay there for almost 20 minutes and have no access to our prefrontal cortex.
Sure, yeah.
And you'll notice that if someone is really escalated and you're trying to talk to them and you're saying the perfect words, you have the perfect tone of voice, you could be talking for 5 or 10 minutes. And you're getting nowhere because the person can't even access the logical part of their brain.
He's left the room.
He's right, exactly.
Yeah.
So you get really frustrated and then they get frustrated. And the best thing you can do in that situation is you have to focus on calming first. Don't even bother. If you notice someone is escalated like that, then, don't engage in logic because just recognize this is biology. This is happening. Just accept it. It's not you or anything else. It's not a personal thing. Right. So, and then that, of course, is where you get the fight or flight, the adrenaline, the cortisol coming from in that perspective. So that, when we talk about the biology piece of it, I just think that is really important for people to understand that just let that cooling off period happen. It's like not a personal attack against you. It's just recognizing this is just something natural, but being able to identify it.
Sure.
And just as it is, it's really, really helpful. Right?
And I guess also identifying the triggers that go along with that too, right?
Exactly. And
because you could just say something very simple and all of a sudden the person has gone from 0 to 100 in a millisecond.
Right. That's right. And that limbic system was designed obviously to keep us safe.
Sure,
The primary
absolutely.
purpose, are you safe or are you in danger?
Right.
But the problem, like in the workplace, is that, well, obviously we don't have a saber-toothed tiger coming at us,
Hey,
right?
just someone who looks like it.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the psychological. It's not a physical threat. It's a psychological threat.
Yeah,
So, but our brain don't know the difference. We
exactly.
have the exact same biological reaction as if it's that tiger coming at us.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's where you get the fight or flight.
What? Okay, that's the problem. Let's look at how do we fix it. So what in your experience, what approach is the most effective?
So when I do training, I actually take people through some different conflict management styles. And I'm sure you've heard of them before. Thomas Kilman had developed these. I mean, my gosh, it goes back as far as the 70s. But, these different 5 styles, right? So you have compete, you have avoid,
Yeah.
accommodate, collaborate, and compromise.
Right.
And it's interesting that when I do this work with people, like, people tend to think that collaboration, like that's the gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
That is the best approach, is to collaborate with people,
Yep.
Get them in a room, get them talking, but the problem is that that's not always the best approach. Being able to understand what's going on in the situation, when you know what's happening, and then you can be selective in the approach that you're using, because collaboration takes a lot of time. So if you don't have much time, then that's not an approach you're going to use. If go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Sorry.
That's all right. I was going to say, like, if the issue is not really important to you, then why are you going to use collaboration?
Well, yeah,
or if there's zero trust, or people don't have any communication skills or things like that, then why use collaborate?
And I guess if it's really low down in importance in the organization, then do you really need to spend a lot of time at that, right?
Exactly.
Or
That's right.
or you could have an issue where obviously there are many situations where not both people are right.
Right.
So you
Yeah.
have to come up with a decision to move forward where both parties accept, and you won't always get a win-win situation, will you?
No. And that's the thing, right? So when you look at, are you in a situation like where there's overwhelming stress? How important is the topic? Is there enough time to discuss it? Is there trust? Are the communication skills? How important is the relationship?
Yeah.
Maybe it's where you'll never see the person again.
Yeah.
So you're not going to use collaboration.
Yeah.
So that's like a misnomer. It's being able to use the styles appropriately, and you might even switch between them in the same conversation.
Sure, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, right. So you need to resolve the issue. However, you need to resolve it as quickly as you can so you move forward.
Well, it's quick, being able to do it quickly is one thing, but effectively.
Oh, exactly.
Right?
Sure.
So,
sure. Yeah. You don't want it to drag on for months and months and months, right?
No, that's right. And when, I said earlier that, often people are conflict avoidant, and that's looked at as a bad thing.
Sure.
But guess what? There's going to be times in which avoidance is the best strategy that you could use in a situation.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Thing is, don't overuse. If you are constantly avoiding any interaction and avoiding conflict, that's a bad thing.
Well, there's a book, Mate, I think his name is, When the Body Says No, and he
Gabor
says,
Mate.
Yeah, Gabor Mate. He wrote a book, When the Body Says No, and he says we really need. Yeah, it's a fabulous book. We really need to learn how to constructively express our feelings, because the more we hold our feelings in, the more that turns to resentment and anger and hatred. And so when you're continually doing that, as you said, that can be very problematic. And the next thing, the person is off on stress leave.
Yeah. And, I've heard people say too that they avoid because they don't want to hurt the other person. or they don't
Sure.
want to engage in a conversation that's going to damage their relationship.
Right. Sure.
But oftentimes what ends up happening is by avoiding it, you actually do damage the relationship.
Sure. Yeah.
So it has that effect, and that's not really what you want. So like I said, there's lots of different approaches to, to conflict management. It's getting used to getting comfortable with each of them and when to use them.
Yeah.
It's more like thinking about it first before you're actually going in.
Yeah,
to have the conversation.
and I guess the biggest, one of the biggest questions to ask is this relationship, like you said, if you're in a big organization, you may never see that person ever again. That's one thing, but if you have to work with that person on a daily basis, then that relationship is important. So it's critical that you figure out how to work together so that both of you feel as though you came out on the right side of this conflict, right?
Right. And when the relationship is important, I mean, yes, collaboration is definitely one to use. And there's times you might use an accommodating approach. There might be a situation in which you're giving in to the other person and the issue is not as important to you.
Yeah.
Right. But that's another strategy. So
Sure.
Getting used to those styles and being able to use them, I find you can't control what the other person is going to do. You can only control, obviously, your reaction and your approach, right?
Yeah. The classic cognitive behavioral therapy approach is never what happens to you. It's your belief in what happens to you.
Yeah.
Any other tips, general tips for conflict management? I mean, I guess some of these things that you use in the workplace can also be used at home, correct?
Oh my gosh, definitely. That's one of the things that I love so much about conflict management is the fact it's not only in the workplace. The skills that you learn it's in the workplace, it's parenting, it's with your partner, it's any skill that you use that will help you more effectively communicate or deal with conflict is going to benefit you in the world. And one of the biggest, I guess, tools that there's two of my favorites. There's a ton of tools out there, Gary, but
sure, yeah.
Two of my favorites are, one of them is the ladder of inference, and I don't know if you've ever heard of that. That was developed by Chris Ardress. He's a psychologist, and Peter Sanjay used it in the Fifth Discipline book.
Okay.
And that's part of what my company logo is based. The ladder between the C is based on this.
Okay.
That's where it came from. I really like it. Okay. So basically, I don't have a visual to take people through, but if they just picture, I guess, a ladder, and at the bottom of that ladder is the starting point.
Okay.
So that's where you have all this information, like you were saying earlier, you have all this information available to you, all the facts, all the data, everything that's going on around you. And if you picture just like a video camera, right, that's capturing that information. Yeah. So all that data is available, but we're only going to select a little bit of that data, and it's going to be based on our beliefs or our previous experiences. And then we're going to take that limited information and now we're going to add meaning to it. So if someone did something or said something to us, this is the process that we're going through, right? So we're interpreting that behavior, and then we're making assumptions about it. We're going to draw those conclusions. This is working up the ladder now.
Absolutely.
Each rung of the ladder has each of these things on it.
Okay.
Obviously we're going to develop beliefs about it, and then we're going to take our action.
Okay.
Right. And we think our action is right because they're based on what we believe.
Right.
And we tend to jump rungs on the ladder. We jump to a conclusion quickly. This is not something that takes 10 minutes. This can happen in seconds. Boom. We make our interpretation, and all that, and then we act. It can happen really, really quickly.
Sure.
So what I love about this tool, though, is that before you get, whether you're at the top of the ladder where you're ready to make a decision, or whether you're halfway through, challenging yourself by working yourself down the rungs of the ladder. So from wherever you are on it, you analyze your reasoning, you work back down the ladder, and you help trace the facts and the reality that you're actually working with.
Right. Okay.
So asking yourself all the questions like, why have I chosen this decision or this action? Mm-hmm. Is there anything else I could have considered? What belief did I have? You know, what am I assuming?
Right.
What data have I chosen to use and why? Like things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as you start to analyze and then you work yourself back up, most often you're going to get to a different conclusion.
Sure.
Then
Yeah.
and take a different action.
Yeah,
right?
because that latter approach gives you a chance to look at things from the right side of your brain, which is the logic side, and kind of
Yeah.
remove the emotion from it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I find that, I mean, obviously we don't do enough reflection. We're just very quick to the mark. Something happens, boom, we're reacting to it.
Right.
And one of the examples, often people I'm sure have experienced this, but if whether you're in a board meeting or whatever, any meeting that you've been in, and someone is up at the front and they're delivering their whatever topic that they're talking about or speaking, and then they look down and they see someone on their phone.
Yeah.
So, like, what is the first thing that goes through your mind when you're up there? You've spent hours preparing for this. Let's say you're presenting something or a training, and you have people down there looking at their phones. Like, what's the first thing that goes through your mind?
I guess that person is ignorant.
Ignorant.
Right? That would be one of my things. You know, they're not. I wouldn't think that, you know, they're not engaged. I would think that, you know, they should have more consideration if they're there. That would be my first impression.
Right.
Now maybe he's bored. Maybe I'm not a good presenter, and he'd rather be on his phone than fall asleep. You know, I mean, that's an assumption as well, right?
Yeah, they all are, for sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but the first thing that goes through our minds are things like that. They're ignorant. You know, they don't have any respect for what I'm doing. They don't care about what I'm talking about.
Right.
You know, they're not, if it's a meeting in a workplace, like, they're not contributing. They're just indifferent. They're,
they know everything. You can't teach me anything, right?
Yeah,
I'm not
it's
here to
all these
learn.
negative. Yeah, it's all these negative meanings, right? We just assume they don't care.
Now, he could be on the phone because his wife was admitted to hospital too, right? And he's checking on her, right? So that's the problem with making the assumption of why the person is on the phone.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but then what happens is, like, you could make then a decision, a very negative decision that comes from that. Because if you think someone don't care, you might even say to yourself, well, I'm not going to, if it's a board meeting or another, you know, team meeting, you might say, well, if they don't care and they don't want to be here, I'm not going to invite them anymore. Right. And then you end up not inviting them. Yeah. It's like, okay, what's the consequence of that?
The question I get people to ask themselves when they're making an assumption is, am I thinking this or is it a fact? And when someone is on the phone, the only fact that you know is that he's on the phone. You don't know why he's on the phone. It's like when the guy cuts you off in traffic. You could make the assumption he's a crazy driver, but the only thing that you know that's fact is that he cut you off. He could be on his way to the hospital.
Exactly.
He could be on his way to a funeral home. You know, who knows where he is. So that's stepping back and just saying, am I thinking this or is it a fact? And in most cases, you're just thinking it. So stop thinking it.
Right. And that's the fundamental attribution error. Yeah. You know, like we think that we understand and we know people's motives for what they do. Right. We really think we do, and we have no idea.
The biggest mental mistake, the biggest irrational thought that humans have are assumptions. Yes. That is the most common mistake that we all make. Yeah. And trying to figure out how to step back and not make that assumption. Tammy, can you leave our listeners, and great conversation, by the way. I always get a lot when I interview professionals like yourself, and so when we finish up, is there anything that you can leave people with that can help them deal with any type of conflict that they have in their life, so that they can come to a peaceful resolution, so that they can move forward?
There's so many things, Gary, so many tips, you know, but they all hinge on effective communication. Taking that time to understand, like, what's underlying someone's position, because we think we know, right? They're entrenched in their position. We think we know why, but oftentimes we don't. And when we don't understand what's underlying that, and what's contributing to it, how can you move forward to resolve any conflict? If you're not going to if you're not going to communicate with someone, how can you resolve an issue?
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
If you're stuck on this, I'm right, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And you even refuse to mediate it.
Yeah.
Like if you want an apology, for example, as I said earlier, then that's not being helpful.
Right.
So when you can start to understand what's underneath someone's position, asking them, like being curious, genuinely being curious, asking them open-ended questions. Don't ask the why, because if you're going to say why, that's going to trigger some defensiveness.
Why is probably the most useless question you could ask, because the answer is only going to validate the person's reason why he's upset in the first place.
Well, it's going to make him go on the defensive and get his back up.
Exactly.
And that's not what you want. You want them open to, but it has to be genuine.
The simplest way is, as Stephen Covey says, I think, listen to understand instead of listening to respond.
Yeah, exactly.
And go ahead.
Yeah. So all of those things, and even little things that we say, can escalate conflict. Like if we're going to use absolutes in our statements, like you always, or you never.
Yeah.
Well, you've just made the response you're going to get is all about someone defending that. Well, I don't always do that.
Right.
And you lose sight of the whole issue.
Yeah.
Right. So things like that aren't helpful, and just your frame of mind, so I hear people when they go into they know they have a meeting scheduled, they think it's going to be difficult, and their whole mindset is it's going to be a disaster. Everything is going to go wrong, and they're picturing that. And then what do you think is going to happen?
A self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Staying curious though, just a little bit longer, and really trying to understand where someone is coming from, and recognizing that you may 100% think that you're right, but guess what? There's always another story. So be careful of the story that you're telling yourself.
Yeah.
I remember a Wayne Dyer quote, and I'm sure you've heard this before, of when you change the way you think about things, the things you think about change.
Right.
As you know, the power of our thoughts.
Absolutely.
Are so incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll leave off maybe with just one of my favorite quotes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so go right ahead.
Yeah, and at the end of my trainings, I always bring this up on a slide, but Maya Angelou said that I've learned that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel.
And that's, I love that quote too. And I always say to people, when you're in an interaction, when you're in communications with someone, just step back for a second, hit the pause button, and ask yourself, at this point in time, how am I making that person feel?
Mm-hmm.
And that's so critical. Tammy, thank you very much. It's been eye-opening and great. I really appreciate your input, and you're certainly welcome anytime to come back and talk about any other area you'd like to talk about. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
No problem. Thank you.